Russia, China and North Korea. Individually, all three countries represent threats to the global order. But when they're working together, as they have done increasingly over the last few years, their combined actions could be the catalyst for World War III. The last couple of weeks have seen all three making key moves to not only strengthen themselves but reinforce the alliances built between them. World War III may not be on the immediate horizon, but with these actions, hints are emerging that the trio is preparing for a fight, even as the West tries to mitigate their efforts. Let's start with North Korea. On April 28, North Korea officially confirmed that it was sending troops to fight alongside Russia in the Ukraine war. That was hardly a surprise to those who've been paying attention to the war. Independent commentators the world over, along with Ukraine, had already pointed out that North Korean soldiers were fighting for Russia. They were present in Kursk, which is the Russian oblast subjected to a Ukrainian counter-invasion in August 2024, and they've been used by Putin since at least late 2024. However, the use of North Korean troops came with no confirmation from either Russia or North Korea. Both countries refused to acknowledge their cooperation for months. Now, that's all changed. In a statement published by North Korea's KCNA news agency, the North Korean Central Military Commission claimed that its troops had helped Russia to completely liberate Kursk. The commission also confirmed that the order to send those troops came directly from North Korea's dictatorial supreme leader, Kim Jong-un. The statement continued, "Comrade Kim Jong-un decided on our armed forces' participation in the war, informed the Russian side of it, and in accordance with agreement issued an order to annihilate and wipe out the Ukrainian neo-Nazi occupiers and liberate the Kursk area in cooperation with the Russian armed forces." The statement later went on to say that Kim saw the mission as sacred and that it consolidates a growing friendship between Russia and North Korea that is now as firm as a rock. That's not all. North Korea's confirmation was far from one-sided. A follow-up statement from Putin directly thanks North Korea for its involvement. "We highly appreciate this and are sincerely grateful, personally to the chairman of the State Affairs Committee, Comrade Kim Jong-un, as well as to the entire leadership and the people of North Korea." Putin also claimed that Russia will always honor the Korean heroes who gave their lives for Russia, for our common freedom, on par with their Russian brothers in arms. The statements only confirm what most already knew. According to the New York Times, North Korea has sent as many as 14,000 soldiers to Russia, most of whom were supposedly part of the elite Storm Corps Special Forces unit. The initial deployment, which took place in late 2024, included around 10,000 to 12,000 troops. In early 2025, North Korea is believed to have sent another 3,000 soldiers to replace the 4,000 troops who have been killed or injured in Kursk. In addition to this manpower, the outlet says, North Korea has also provided Russia with millions of artillery shells, which it's now using to pound away at Ukrainian cities. The moves came in the wake of Russia and North Korea signing a cooperative defense pact in the summer of 2024. That pact included an article stating that each country shall immediately provide military and other assistance to the other if either falls into a state of war due to an armed invasion from an individual or multiple states. Ukraine's counter-invasion of Kursk apparently met that criterion, leading to North Korea sending its soldiers. Analysts believe that the pact creates a win-win situation for Russia and North Korea. For Russia, it means that President Vladimir Putin gets influxes of troops whenever he needs them. If Ukraine attempts to take Russian territory again, Russia's leader now knows that he can rely on North Korea to help him take it back. For North Korea, the pact allows it to gain leverage over Putin. How it will use that leverage isn't 100% clear. It's possible that North Korea may lean on Putin to deliver Russian nuclear weapons secrets in return for its manpower. Or, as the New York Times suggests, Kim may try to use Putin's relationship with US President Donald Trump to bring his country in from the cold and integrate it into the global order. But hold on a second, why does all of this matter? If it's already known that North Korea was sending soldiers to Russia, what use is a confirmation of that fact? The answer is simple. North Korea and Russia are no longer trying to hide the fact that they're working together. Before this confirmation, both countries could claim there was nothing between them beyond a pact. They played a diplomatic game that offered them plausible deniability if they were pressed. Now that the cooperation is fully out in the open, the situation involves two countries who are confident that they'll face no ramifications for their cooperation. That's worrying for both Ukraine and the rest of the world. For Ukraine, it likely means that more North Korean soldiers head to Russia. Those soldiers also may not limit their activities to Russia itself. It may not be long before we see North Koreans fighting in Ukraine, reinforcing the troops Russia already has stationed there. As for the rest of the world, the confirmation sends a message. Start or engage in a fight with either Russia or North Korea, and you face the wrath of both nations. The confirmation cements an alliance that was already in place. In doing so, it raises tensions around the world and potentially hints that Russia and North Korea will work together on future military efforts. What those efforts might be is up for debate. Could Russia send soldiers to help North Korea wage war against South Korea? Might Kim extend the leverage he has over Putin by sending troops to support Russia if it extends its attention to the rest of Europe after the Ukraine war? There aren't any clear answers. However, either situation is plausible now that there's official confirmation of cooperation. And if either occurs, World War III begins. That brings us to China. As Russia and North Korea confirm and strengthen their alliance, China is up to some interesting tricks in the South China Sea. On April 27, reports started circulating that the Chinese Coast Guard had sent several of its ships to a tiny reef known as Sandy Cay. Located within the Spratly Islands, which is an archipelago in the South China Sea that has 12 naturally occurring islets and several smaller reefs. Sandy Cay seems unimportant. It's absolutely tiny, so much so that the reef gets completely submerged during high tide. However, the 2,152 square foot island now lies at the center of a dispute between China and the Philippines that's been heating up for years. Why? There are a few reasons. Firstly, Sandy Cay is close to a Philippine military outpost on Thitu Island, which is also part of the Spratly Islands. By seizing Sandy Cay, China was encroaching on territory the Philippines believes doesn't belong to it. When Chinese Coast Guard personnel landed on the reef, they also unfurled a Chinese flag. The message being sent to the Philippines was clear: China owns this reef and it will soon own the entire Spratlys. The Philippines responded days later by sending its own military personnel to Sandy Cay, where they unfurled a Philippine flag. Since then, the two countries have delivered opposing reports about what's happening on Sandy Cay. China claims to have pushed out all Philippine presence. The Philippines says that's not the case, and it's actively contesting what it sees as an illegitimate attempt by China to claim an island that it doesn't own. In short, there's a territorial dispute brewing on a tiny island in the South China Sea, and that dispute has the potential to boil over into something much larger. Why? It's a microcosm of a much larger issue. The South China Sea is one of the world's most important waterways. According to China Power, around 21% of global trade sails through the sea, amounting to $3.4 trillion annually as of 2016. China is the major beneficiary of that trade. It accounts for $874 billion of the $3.4 trillion in exports alone. All of this matters because of a simple fact. China wants full control over the South China Sea. That's where its dispute with the Philippines, what's happening on Sandy Cay, and China's arguments with other nations bordering the South China Sea, such as Vietnam and Malaysia, come into play. Under international maritime law, a coastal country can claim as its sovereign territory all of the waters that extend up to 12 nautical miles from its coastline. Beyond those 12 miles, a country can also create an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, that extends up to 200 nautical miles. An EEZ isn't sovereign water. However, the country that owns the EEZ does have the right to exploit those waters for natural resources such as gas, oil and fish. China contends that it owns almost the entire South China Sea. It has released maps, including its famous 9-dash line maps, that demonstrate its belief in this fact. However, international maritime law prevents those claims from being officially recognized. That's where tiny islands like Sandy Cay become important. China's attempt to claim Sandy Cay is part of a wider effort to build a great wall of sand in the South China Sea. These efforts include the creation of artificial islands in the Spratlys and within another island group known as the Paracels. Combine those artificial islands with takeovers, such as what was seen on April 27, and a plan starts to unfurl. China is trying to use these islands to reinforce its claims to the South China Sea. With each island claimed comes new coastlines that China owns. That amounts to 12 more miles of new sovereign territory, along with the EEZs that comes with that territory. China plans to claim as many tiny islands in the South China Sea as it can, no matter what the rest of the world thinks about it, so it can use international maritime law to say it essentially owns the South China Sea. What does any of this have to do with its growing alliances with Russia and North Korea? Think about what that control could mean for global trade. If China owns the South China Sea, that also means it oversees over 20% of the world's trade. That oversight gives China political leverage that it, Russia and North Korea could all use to their advantage. Take Russia as an example. Right now it's dealing with heavy sanctions imposed on it by the West in response to Putin's Ukraine invasion. If China owns the South China Sea, Putin can leverage his alliance with China to convince the country to ban European and American vessels from using the waterway. That would cause major supply issues, potentially damaging the economies of the nations against which China and Russia are allied. The US offers a perfect example. China Power says that $1.2 trillion of the trade that flows through the South China Sea annually is accounted for by the United States. Imagine if all of that trade suddenly goes away. China chokes out US access to the South China Sea with support from Russia, and the US is left with $1 trillion gap in its economy. Ultimately, what happened on Sandy Cay is all about leverage. China wants more of it, with seemingly insignificant moves like taking over a tiny reef being one of the methods it's using to gain leverage. And that's before considering the fact that the Philippines is the country against which China is working in the Sandy Cay dispute. Why does that matter? The Philippines just so happens to be deeply allied to the United States on a military level. The US Department of State calls the Philippines an irreplaceable US ally for 7 decades, while noting that the country is key to the US, maintaining its influence and a distinct military presence in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific region. Since 2015, the US has provided the Philippines with more than $463 million in security assistance, along with engaging over $1 billion of trade under the Foreign Military Sales System. The US also has military bases in the Philippines, several of them. In 2023, the US committed $80 million to improve the infrastructure at its 5 bases: Basa Air Base, Fort Magsaysay, Antonio Bautista Air Base, Lumbia Air Base, and Benito Ebuen Air Base. These financial commitments demonstrate that the Philippines is far more than a vague security partner. The country is vital to America's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. That vitality casts a new light on what's happening at Sandy Cay. What at first glance seems to be an insignificant island takeover is actually a potential powder keg that could ignite into a global conflict. China is trying to use Sandy Cay and islands like it to control the South China Sea. With that control comes the ability to hurt the US, which benefits Russia and North Korea as much as it does China. The US naturally opposes these Chinese efforts through its support of the Philippines. Ask yourself, what happens if these seemingly small skirmishes between China and the Philippines evolve into full-blown fighting? The Philippines would call on the US to help. China would respond by calling on Russia, which in turn might ask North Korea for soldiers, as it already has done for the Ukraine war. Suddenly, a 2,000 square foot island becomes a key battleground for a global war. There are already clear hints that the US is preparing to respond to the Sandy Cay issue. Defense Secretary Peter Hegseth has already claimed that the US is doubling down on its alliance with the Philippines in what he says is an effort to re-establish deterrence against China. If those efforts don't work, leading to China trying to claim even more of the South China Sea's tiny islands, the US may have to get even more involved than it already is. By now, several potential catalysts for World War III are emerging out of the alliances between Russia, China, and North Korea. Adding to what's been touched upon so far is another major issue that may upset the global geopolitical balance: Crimea. One of the major issues coming out of these strengthened alliances is that Russia is feeling far more confident about its Ukraine invasion than it has for years. That's more evident in Crimea than anywhere else. Now, it's important to note that China doesn't technically support Russia's annexation of Crimea, which Putin's forces carried out in 2014. King's College London says that China only offered political support in the wake of the annexation without outright recognizing that Crimea is Russian territory. That was still more than what the rest of the world offered to Russia. Most countries, including the US, decried Russia's actions and continue to recognize Crimea as Ukrainian territory that is simply under Russian control due to the annexation. However, that might change soon, and that would only mean good things for the alliance between Russia, China, and North Korea. Toward the end of April, President Trump suggested that he believes Ukraine might be willing to give up Crimea altogether in exchange for peace with Russia. "I think so," were Trump's exact words when asked about the possibility, suggesting that the US president believes Ukraine is prepared to dramatically change its stance on Crimea. Sky News reports that Trump's comments were likely an effort to ramp up pressure on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to agree to end his country's fight against Russia. That pressure likely won't work. Crimea is vital to both Russia and Ukraine. Putin is on record as calling Crimea a sacred place. Whoever controls the territory also controls activities in the Black Sea. Russia has tried to use that to its advantage in the Ukraine war by unleashing its Black Sea fleet on Ukraine, though that fleet hasn't had the impact Putin would have hoped. Around a third of the fleet's ships are now destroyed or damaged, though Putin still holds on to Crimea. Having any sort of official recognition that Russia owns Crimea will be massive for Russia and its Chinese and North Korean allies. Why? It sets a precedent, one that could lead to World War III. Think about what the confirmation of Crimean ownership for Russia would mean for the future. It would show Putin that he's able to claim territory by force as long as he keeps fighting for it. Right now, Russia holds around 20% of Ukraine, including much of the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. What's to stop him from exerting similar pressure to that seen in Crimea to convince the US to push Ukraine into accepting the loss of those territories? And if Russia gains 20% of Ukraine, what's to stop Putin from launching future invasions to take even more of the country? Putin might even use this capitulation to justify the complete takeover of Ukraine, which he could then use as a launching pad for future European invasions targeting the Baltic states, Poland, and other countries that oppose Russia. The precedent set could also play into China's hands. Right now, the US is allied with the Philippines, as it has reinforced after the Sandy Cay incident. However, China will have paid attention to America's roller coaster strategy for Ukraine in recent months. Perhaps Beijing thinks it could take advantage of that itself. Maybe it could take islands in the Spratlys and Paracels, while believing it could negotiate for full control over those islands later. Or it might think that Russia getting away with the annexation of Crimea opens the door for an attack on Taiwan without full US intervention. China might be wrong on that front. The US seems far more interested in what's happening in the Indo-Pacific than what's happening in Europe right now. But the precedent set by Russia being granted Crimea opens the door for China, and perhaps even North Korea, to make moves that the rest of the world doesn't expect. Those moves would either see each nation go to war against much smaller powers, which is a mini world war in itself, or pull the US and its allies into a fight. Taken together, these three issues are a combination of relatively small problems that could explode into something much more. Russia and North Korea's direct confirmation of their cooperation means that any nation that opposes them now faces a joint force. China's action in the South China Sea could cause major supply chain issues that benefit itself, Russia, and North Korea as China sees fit. And if Russia gains official control over Crimea, a precedent is set that could lead to chaos elsewhere. The West may be sleepwalking into a global war against three terrifying military powers. The final question is simple. What happens if Russia, China, and North Korea go all in and declare war? So let us know what you think the answer might be in the comments, along with sharing your opinions over all of the moves carried out by this trio of allied anti-West powers over the last few months. Are they signs that Russia, China and North Korea are preparing for a global war? Tell us what you think in the comments and subscribe to The Military Show for more commentary on the latest geopolitical events that could upset the global power balance.